yeah, this week we are looking at ethics, ethos. So we call it ethics, ethos and politics. And I think we all probably realized from last week, there is no way that you can talk about this work without it being about politics. So I think and politics should be part of every single session that we're running in many ways. So yeah, welcome back. Before we start, Kerry, do you want to say anything as co-director before you then become our guest?
No, not really. I'll say something at the end. But apart from, yeah, I wasn't expecting to be in the hot seat, so I'm in the hot seat. And fingers crossed it'll all be fine. Okay, that's all I want to say.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think we're going to start. So I'll just introduce you to our speakers. So Fox Irving, who we'll probably say hello in a moment, is an independent artist producer whose work looks and examines glass. And yeah, Fox, if you just want to say a quick hello to people, that'd be nice. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Fox. Looking forward to the conversation today and your questions.
Thank you. And then we have Anne-Marie Cullhane, who's an eco-social artist, an activist and facilitator who likes to create spaces for learning, reflecting, doing, and making things together in ways that cause minimum impact on our planet. So I'm keeping everybody's introductions quite brief because you're all going to talk about your practice and introduce yourselves a bit more formally. But Anne-Marie, if you just want.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really nice to see you all and looking forward to today.
Thank you. And Stella Barnes, who's Creative Director of CAN, Community Arts Northwest in Greater Manchester, who worked for a long time in London before returning north. We were just talking about that before you all joined us, the number of us who are creeping back north from having lived in the south. So Stella has a background as a theatre maker, facilitator and cultural activist with a special interest in arts and migration and unheard voices, giving space for unheard voices. So Stella, if you want to.
Hi everyone, it's really lovely to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And Kerry, you know, but I should introduce her formally for the recording. Kerry Morrison is co-director of Faculty North. She's an interdisciplinary environmental artist and educator and was one of the 3 artist founders of In Situ, who are one of the 2 partners who run the faculty. So Kerry, you could say another hello.
Yeah, hello, and yeah, good to be on the panel. Looking forward to it.
So thank you. So I'm going to start with our first question. And I think I'm going to start with Anne-Marie, if you don't mind. And I'm going to ask you, how do you describe your practice and tell us something about the ethos behind that practice, including collaborative, human and more than human, social art and environmental art approaches. So how, you know, tell us about your practice in those terms.
Okay. Yeah, as Chrissie said, I have an eco-social practice. That's not a phrase that I came up with, and it feels a bit awkward because it's, yeah, I think describing the practice takes about a paragraph, so I'm going to just talk through some of what eco-social means. So the eco is links to ecology and environment. So what I'm looking at in the practice is to explore my relationship, and usually with other people, so a kind of collective sense of what is our relationship to the natural world and earth systems. And always I'm trying to look at that from a kind of position of being part of those systems rather than outside of. So I'm trying to develop a sense of, yeah, being part of natural systems and what I would call ecological identity. So our identity as inhabitants on a planet that we are part of, not separate from. So I guess this is a lifelong exploration for me in my practice, and I work with lots of different people to explore these questions. I might be working with farmers, I might be working with food growers or scientists and researchers. I might be working with schools and school children or school teachers. I might be working with writers, community groups. And also when I'm working with what I would broadly call communities or communities of interest, I'm trying to always think of those communities as the more than human communities. So if I'm working in a park or a public space, I'm thinking about all the people who might use those spaces, the history of that space, and all the insects, animals, birds, other beings that inhabit those spaces. So I guess I'm trying to reframe the idea of what community is when I'm working in the public realm. All of my work is in the public realm and involves participation, and very often I'm trying to bring people together from different age groups, so across age groups together, not really kind of working with schools individually or elders individually, but creating spaces when those people can come together across age groups. And the work, as you'll hear later, manifests in different forms. So it can be performative, it can be new ritual, it can be planting trees, it can be cooking and eating and sharing food. It can manifest in lots of different ways. I think that's probably enough for now.
Okay, thank you. That's quite a lot, and interesting to think about that whole sort of rich way in which I think this work is increasingly becoming, you know, across sectors, across generations, across disciplines and things like that. And I think it's really important for us to think, you know, how do we engage, exactly as you said, you know, with ecology as well as with people, with history, with the different elements of this work, and how we bring things together in different kind of ways. So can I move over to you, Stella? Do you want to tell us a little bit about your practice?
Yeah, I find it also quite difficult to describe my practice. I've been in the arts for so many 30-something years, and I still can't quite articulate what I do. I guess it's what I would say is it's value-led and it's social justice-led. And justice is a word that is really important, and it's a word I really like. I've kind of spent all my life being kind of finding it absolutely impossible to accept injustice, and also kind of curious about why some people do accept it or continue to benefit from injustice without questioning it. And so, as somebody who's been creative all my life, my arts practice had to engage with social justice and injustice. And so I suppose I'm interested in my practice, I'm interested in how arts making becomes a more just process through partnerships and through questioning and disrupting who gets to call themselves an artist, and who gets to lead arts processes. So that's part of it, but also thinking about how engaging in creativity, so when people engage in creativity, how that also disrupts social hierarchies and cultural hierarchies. So often I find myself working with individuals or communities who've experienced injustice, and my practice is very much around partnering with people and going on a journey, walking side by side with them, rather than as a sort of more top-down process where the artist leads a community or leads a group of people, which makes it quite a challenge, particularly in theatre. And I mean, maybe other art forms as well, but theatre making traditionally is very hierarchical. You know, you've got the producer and director and all these people, and then the actors who just do what they're told. So trying to work in a non-hierarchical and more just way in theatre does ruffle quite a lot of feathers.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, ruffling feathers in who gets to make art, how we walk alongside people rather than leading them, how we deal with hierarchies, how we deal with some of the elitism and things like that in this sector. Can I pass over to you, Fox, to tell us a little bit about your work?
Hi, okay, so I hate this question as well. I'm not very good at this question, and I've started, I think the more I do my practice is actually, my practice is about the massive imposter syndrome that I have about being in these spaces and talking about my practice, and the fact that I'm not meant to be here having those conversations. On a government index, I counsel class, basically a counsel estate on benefits. I'm not technically meant to be having a conversation about what my practice is, but my practice is live art. I've put myself into a category of live art, artist producer, because live art allows me to weave in and out the different roles I have within my life. Coming from a benefit class background, I still work full-time as a nurse. And have a full-time kind of art practice as well, because that's my security blanket. But what live art has allowed me to do is to interweave these identities. And what I found, and at first when I started, I was very much wanting to be a traditional artist, but what I found, I think it maybe comes with age, that I found that my identity becomes the form. So my class background, who I am, is my form, and collaboration and care becomes the medium, if I'm going to talk in a traditional art way. And what I do is I seem to be a vessel for voices, for unheard voices, and I have this knack, ability to hold safe spaces and have difficult conversations if needed, and I seem to have this ability to hold those spaces and to have become a platform for people's voices to be heard, unheard voices. For example, my other working class artist, and I'm not a leader. I don't see myself as a leader. I see myself as kind of this conduit, this space where I kind of showcase working class artists, who we are and the struggles we face and how we can move forward and liberate. But yes, so very much group work, being the person holding the space is my practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fox. And I remember your conversation in With For About with Lois at LADA. And, talking exactly about those issues, about who's allowed to speak about this work. And quite often something like live art, people think belongs very much to middle-class artists and things. And it was so exciting to hear about the work that you're making, and sort of seeing how that issue of class, somebody said the other day, everything is class in UK arts and culture, everything is class. And I think, many of us, especially as working class women, and I think that's probably true of almost all of us here, how do we get over that imposter syndrome? How do we begin to say we have a place here and we have a possibility to speak here and things? So I'd like to pass over to Kerry to tell us a little bit about the work you're doing, which probably takes us back to Anne-Marie and some of the links that you have between the issues people have spoken think about, but also then linking back to Anne-Marie's eco. So.
Yeah, it does. It really does, because I would describe my practice as socio-environment, as opposed to, is it socio-ecological or eco-social? But basically it means being concerned with the social and also the environment. So when I think about environment, I think about urban and rural spaces. So I think about the built environment as much as kind of a natural environment, because so many of us, in fact most of the population now, lives in urban communities, and we are basically an urban society in the UK, more so than a rural one. And my work is also very much concerned with inequalities and injustices, but both environmental inequality and injustice, as well as social inequalities and injustice. And like Stella, they've sat very uncomfortably with me all of my life. It's kind of like, how can you be comfortable when you see injustices all around you all of the time, and how can you not do something about that, or at least try and address those things in some way? So I've kind of tried to do sort of tackle various things, but I'm also kind of interested in how we tackle things. I kind of like to find if you like, a common ground, so things that quite a few people are interested in. And I don't like using fear as a motivator. So some of my work is concerned with climate crisis, but I don't really want to sort of use fear as a way of motivating. I want to look at positive ways of coming up with solutions, so far more of a solution focus rather than sort of, you know, worrying about the big issue, because so often we can't tackle the big issues on our own. We need to take kind of small steps, or I think we need to take small steps. And I know I can't take big steps because I'm kind of, you know, a very, very minor, well, I'm, you know, it's minor player. I'm just an individual. So it's, you know, it's kind of, I have to think about what it is that I can do, you know, within what lies within my capacity, within my work. And actually one of those things was the founding of In Situ, because when we're talking about kind of injustices, hierarchical systems and inequalities, I also get quite frustrated about the situation of being an artist, and how difficult it is to be a freelance artist because of the structures, the hierarchical structures within the art system. Makes it very difficult for an independent practitioner to actually have longer term views with their work if we're dependent on receiving commissions. So when we set up In Situ, part of that was about wanting to be embedded in place, working in place, addressing particular issues that have come to us from listening to people. So going to what Fox was saying, what I found through my practice is that I love talking to people. I love having conversations, and I love having ad hoc conversations with anybody. So I'm really interested in just those casual, you know, casual meetings that you'll have with somebody as you're walking along the canal and what they might tell you. But I've also just found that, you know, through loving having chats with people, I think I love hearing people and listening to what they say. And I get told all manner of things. And some things I wish that I'd never been told, because some people will often disclose quite a lot about themselves very quickly because they have an ear, they've got somebody's ear. And so I kind of, you know, I hear things, and some things I find quite shocking, some things I find quite upsetting, some things are very illuminating. And then there's that kind of question with what do you do with all of those things that you hear, and how do you deal with it? And I guess that's where kind of ethos and ethics comes into it, because a lot of stuff never gets repeated. It just sort of stays with me. Anyway, going back to the In Situ thing, with Paul and William Titley and myself, we wanted to be able to pursue our practice as we perceived it in a manner that enabled us to stay in place for a long term. And we realised that as independent individual artists that this was difficult, that we couldn't access enough funding to keep us in one place to do what we're doing, or we'd need another job or something. So we set up In Situ as a non-hierarchical organisation, which I'll probably talk about later. So yeah, to kind of recap, all of my work is about environment, the more than human, listening to voices, whether they're human or more than human. So listening to the environment and taking small steps with people to try and, you know, create, I don't know, maybe a better place to be.
Thanks so much, Kerry. And yeah, I mean, thank all of you for that. And I think all of you in some way have touched upon the second question, but I think what really sort of was interesting to me that was emerging was this whole combination of both listening and giving voice. And I think that it's really interesting, isn't it? Because people like Nick Couldry, who've written a lot about voice, are now writing more about the politics of listening. And I think it's really interesting how those two things combine. So I'm going to move to you, Stella, this time. I'm just going to go round the circle as I see it on the screen, probably, to ask you, you know, why you work in the way you do, and tell us a little bit about the politics and ethics of your work. And in the widest sense, you know, was there a particular moment or movement or, you know, situation that you felt politicized you or made you think about these questions in a particular way?
Yeah, thanks, Chrissie. I guess over the last sort of 30 or so years, sort of certain things have kind of punctuated my thinking. So I grew up in quite a political household. as a child, my parents were both educators and very sort of political and radical in their ideas about education. Then I studied in Yorkshire during the miners' strike, which was a kind of massive event in our political history in the 1980s, and got very involved in kind of activism around that while studying drama. So the two kind of were inextricably linked. But I particularly want to talk about, to pick up on what Kerry said about what you do with what you hear. Because I also come from a family who came to the UK as refugees, and that's had quite a big impact on my work. So for the last 20 years, I've worked a lot with artists who came to the UK as exiles, and young people, and adults as well, who maybe don't call themselves artists, but might be called refugee communities or whatever. And it's that work actually that really made me interrogate what Kerry said about what you do with what you hear, because sort of the beginning of this century, and sort of the 2000s, a lot of artists got really interested in working with refugees, and with refugees, the stories that refugees brought of exile. And this really disturbed me, that artists were going into communities and going into groups of young people, and creating what they called was a safe space, and listening, and then making art out of those stories of exile, and often stories of trauma, and not using that kind of filter that I think Kerry described well about, that not a lot of what you hear doesn't go any further than that there's a responsibility in being the person that listens to those disclosures, and responsibility not to use your curiosity as an artist to make art out of it. That it's not your role to make art out of people's trauma, or to ask them to, or require them to, or to define what the art should be. So there were lots of projects at that time, and probably still, that were called things like Journeys, Home, Suitcase, that defined what the nature of that process would be, and what the content of that process would be, before the project even began, or before anybody was recruited onto that project. And I suppose I've always interrogated my art process, and I've always thought practice shouldn't be fixed. There shouldn't be a way that you work as an artist. You should always be in a conversation with yourself about what your practice is, and how it evolves as you change and develop as a person, and as the world around you changes. And I think the experience of doing that work with people who come to the UK as refugees, it really helped me to distill the practice of partnership, and of something that it's actually the title of a book, but that the idea of making the road by walking, which comes from the title of a book, which is a conversation between two radical educators, Paulo Freire and Miles Horton. And I really like that idea of walking with people on a journey where you're in conversation with them about what the art is going to be, and not deciding before you start that journey what it's going to be. And I found I had to find quite a lot of courage to do that, to trust that we will make something really important together without a plan, without defining it beforehand. And it's a process that people find quite unnerving, because people often want to know what we're going to do. So maybe, like, for instance, I was working with a group of women a few years ago, and they said, "What are we going to do, Stella?" And I said, "I don't know. I just don't know, really. I don't know you. You don't know me. I don't know what creativity means to you. So actually, I don't know what we're going to do. I think we'll find out together." And I find it quite scary, and often people find it quite scary, but I quite like just kind of accepting that fear and doing it anyway.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks. And I love you mentioned we make the road by walking, because it's like one of my Bibles that I always go to. And it's that idea, isn't it, of walking alongside people. Kerry's also mentioned it, Fox has mentioned it. And those ideas of, you know, creating space together, listening, talking, having conversations, and giving people space to make work together. So Fox, it would be lovely to come to you to follow up a little bit on that.
So why do I work in the way I do, and what moment was it for me? First of all, I think that question was, that one of those is a moment when I was like, when did I realise I say working class, but I'm actually benefit class. But working class seems to be the trendy word at the moment. But I know we never sat around on the council estate discussing, having conversations about being a problem to be fixed. And it was enough for me when I was 16 and went to my careers advisor, said I wanted to be an artist, that they laughed in my face and said I'll never make any money from it. For me to go into different roles that was nothing to do with art, because I was just wanted to break the cycle I was in at the time. And so that was a moment for me. And again, I'm from Liverpool, so I've got like a massive like badges of honour being a Scouser, being working class, benefit class. It's really like, you know, we're quite political in Liverpool. We're quite like cheeky and like, you know, a strong heritage. And it wasn't the moment I realised it was a problem was when I entered the arts. Basically, I entered this kind of elite dominated world of the arts where I was seen as a problem that needed to be fixed. And I went back to art school. I went to art school when I was 30 and started to try and navigate the arts. And I started talking differently, wearing different clothes, desperate to fit in. But there was just a pivotal moment that I was like, what am I doing? And I had a moment where I did a workshop with a mentor. First time I had a mentor that talked like me, was working class, and I could really thrive and be in this space and finally make work. None of my university lecturers, none of that, it was outside. And to be around somebody like me from my background where my work could thrive was quite a pivotal moment for me. And ever since that, I've been wanting to make these spaces for underclass artists to come together, to support each other, and to kind of rise together. So yeah, those are the moments I find were quite key for me politically. I've always been quite political, actually climate activist for a long time, and it wasn't until Brexit, dare I say it, that I realised how much the media had a hold on the working class narrative, and how working class is basically blamed for Brexit. And so I wanted to get those voices heard. So those are kind of how I got politicised and kind of why I work in the way I do.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it, this sort of idea of both people traveling, people moving, people being situated in certain places, and then also, you know, the surroundings that they find themselves in, and the connection between that seems to be a really important thread coming through. So could I move to you, Kerry, and ask you to follow up a little bit on that, about why you make the work?
Yeah, and interesting, following on from what something Fox said, a couple of things actually. One is that you went to a careers advisor when you were 16. So did I. So I didn't, not the school one, but I went to an independent one in the town. And went to a careers advisor, and he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, oh, I don't know. I said, I think there's this thing called art and I quite like it, and that's what I'd really like to do, I think. And he said, well, it's a tricky thing to want to do because there's no money in it. So my advice is you pop down to the art school with a few of your drawings, see if you can get in. And then if you do want to be an artist, then I suggest you get a job as a postie. So you can do your rounds in the morning, get it all done, you'll be finished by noon, and then you've got the rest of the day to do your art. And I swear that was the best bit of advice I've ever been given, because that's how I started my career, not as a postie, but as a cleaner. So I used to do cleaning till noon, And then I'd spend the rest of the day in the studio making my own stuff. I mean, it was very low income I was on, obviously. But yeah, so his advice was sound advice. But I think, and this is something that's been on the Miro board. So a Miro board was set up by Ruth and Claire. And I think, I can't remember what the question was, but the answer was, you know, some people said that, like, you know, was it something like, I can't remember, but people had mentioned feeling like an outsider or being an outsider. And that was the case for me. I never felt like I fitted in for what in the, you know, the society I grew up in. Never felt like I fitted. And the one thing that politicized me at that time was punk, because it was in the time of punk, and I really identified with punk and much of the lyrics of punk, and a lot of that was political. So I love the Clash and I love Crass and stuff like that. So punk is what politicized me. And when I did go to art school, so I went to art school at 16, having taken a roll of drawings with me that, you know, wrapped up in an elastic band, and just turned up on the doorstep saying I wanted to be an artist. And when I got into art school, something remarkable kind of happened. And it was, the way I describe it was like I was, I'd felt like I'd lived my life up until that point behind curtains. And when I got into art school, it was like I was on a proscenium art stage with the curtains down, and the curtains came open, and I saw a whole world in front of me that I didn't know existed. So I didn't grow up in a political household, didn't grow up in a household that had art or valued art, didn't know anything about that. And it was like a whole world opened, and I found that I was with people who were kind of like-minded. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was amongst people who were as equally odd or queer or whatever as I was, and being able to bounce ideas around and do things that were a bit risky. So yeah, those are the kind of things that started me in realizing that a lot of people like myself then, no idea of what art is or what art can be or what art can do. And so one of the things that I've done in my practice is, you know, I tend to be, I don't have a studio practice, I have an outside practice. So everything happens outside. All of my researching and learning and everything comes from the outside. I read papers as well, so and journals and books and things. But and I kind of meet people when I'm out in the community, and that's kind of what feeds me. But I also think that it's important that I tell people what I do, so I don't shy from the language. I try and bring people into that language. So I'll tell people, you know, oh, you know, I'm an artist, and what I do is socially engaged practice. And then they'll ask what that is. So I'll talk a little bit about what that is. So the way I look at that is that kind of making art more accessible by bringing people into the language and the world that I know, and that the world that kind of changed my life. And I want more people to sort of have access to that. And again, that's what we were wanting to do with In Situ, is to make sure, you know, to bring art and contemporary arts practice to a corner of Lancashire that wasn't really getting any of that. And just to see, you know, just to bring it in and see if there were any, if it had any kind of eureka moments for others like it did for me. And going back to that In Situ thing, and something you said, Stella, because I really cannot stand this way that, you know, the way in which some artists mine communities. I find it quite abhorrent. I really do think it's very distasteful and disrespectful. And I can use other words as well. So, but that first year with In Situ, I didn't actually do anything apart from walking the streets and talking to people and understanding the environment and the place that I was in, and listening to what people were saying, and then having more conversations with those people. So collectively, we can kind of find a focus of where we want to, you know, or find something that we want to focus on, which in Situ was an old derelict mill, which everybody was talking about. So it became quite clear for us that we wanted to sort of place a focus on that space. So yeah, it's, so I don't know whether that explains like the way I work. Maybe it explains a little bit about the politics, which was punk. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. I think punk came up last week as well, didn't it? It's that sort of moment, you know, for many people, a certain generation, that suddenly, wow, working class musicians and speaking about the sort of things that we want to speak about, and in a way that we want to speak about them is really important. But obviously there's other things that are coming through all your work about, you know, listening, spending time with people, and all of you, you know, spoken a lot about spending time with people. So, you know, I want to come to you, Anne-Marie, you know, last but not least about this, because you spoke at the beginning about, you know, the time that you spend with people and how that and the politics have impacted on your work.
Yeah, there's a whole fantastic conversation to have about time, and because a lot of my work takes place outside of the art world, it's not funded by arts organisations. Quite often I get the real privilege of being able to do long projects, which just radically changes the possibilities of what I can do. So I've got a project that's like 10 years old, and like Kerry, it's like that thing about you're in for a long haul. But a lot of projects will last a lifetime, particularly if I'm working with trees and particular places, so that you sort of changing the frames of time that we're working in just kind of makes a real difference to how you can work and the speed at which you can work, and it kind of just slows everything down, which feels much more healthy for everybody and everything. But I just wanted to talk about these sort of key moments for me. One of them was like in 1991 when I studied geography at university. I was really lucky to go to university, and I read an article in 1991 which was about climate change, and it was in like a newspaper, and then I kind of looked up from the newspaper, and it's like, that is so far away from being part of what anyone seems to be talking about, and yet it was already in the popular press, and then and then we talked about other things. But from that moment onwards, I just had that in my head, like, there's this thing going on, no one's talking about it, it's massive. No one's talking about it. So that just sat with me and kind of moved around from being a focal point to being something that just sat in the back of my mind and then kept coming back to the fore. And then, like, I guess direct experiences of ecological injustice that I've physically experienced. So I lived in, before I lived in Devon, I lived in Cornwall, and where we lived, there was a friend of ours contacted us and said that there's hundreds of seabirds, dead seabirds, washing up on the shore. What's going on? She started photographing them. She was trying to rescue them. And then thousands of seabirds were washing up along the shore. So all along the shore from Cornwall to Dorset, there was basically up to 10,000 dead seabirds washing up on the shore. You won't have heard about this. It didn't even make the national news because it happened in Easter, which is when our peak tourist moment happens down in the southwest. So it got covered up. There was a bit of a conspiracy between the environmental organisations and the tourist office and central government to just cover it up. So basically people were coming down to beaches, there were dead birds on there, they're covered in this thing called polyisobutene, which is a lubricant which is used in massive ships. When they all using oil, they need a lubricant in the engines to move the oil around, and it's like PVA. So if anyone makes, you probably might have used PVA in what you do. So it's kind of like that. So imagine birds just covered in that, like they can't physically move, and it was nesting time. So the impact of this, basically a big boat had flushed out their engines much too close to the shore illegally and causing mass devastation along a coast, which you won't have heard of. And so we were going to beaches, finding all these birds, trying to rescue some of them. And that's quite a big thing to physically experience, and to know that no one is even looking at that, that's paying no attention. So that to me is like an example of the kind of ecological disasters that are playing out all the time now in art, that are just pushed to one side. So I guess my work is a way of trying to find out my way of responding to that. And the other thing I wanted to say about sort of moments of politicization is I'm doing a project at the moment called Walking Forests, which is looking at female activism in this country and overseas, and the forest ecosystems. And there's some research been going on since the 90s around how forest ecosystems work. and this idea of mother trees and the passing of nutrients between different trees in a forest system. So originally, well, for many years, let's say hundreds of years, the sort of Western ideology has pursued this idea of trees as being individual things, which we harvest, and then we plant new trees, and we create a whole economic system around how forests work. But forests work completely differently, and there are elements of collaboration between trees, so they do pass nutrients around, and they do potentially kind of support one another under moments of stress, so when there's disease attack. So if you think that the natural world is operating in these completely different, potentially collaborative, collective systems, and that's how it's functioning incredibly effectively, and we're told that actually no, we live in an individualistic world, which is more about how we work as individuals. So I just think there's so much learning from natural systems that can help guide us in social systems. So that's something I guess I just focus primarily on, trying to draw that into the consciousness of how we can be together. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's interesting, isn't it, coming across that idea of, trees collaborating and nature collaborating, that a lot of people, now moving totally against the Darwinian theory of things, it's a survival of the fittest. No, but, early people, the very earliest people survived by being collaborators. And that's the way they lived, and that's the way they built community, and that's the way they existed. And I think this sort of idea, this very sort of capitalist and becoming to neoliberalist idea that, it's about being the fittest, and these were the strongest animals, or these were the strongest plants, or, in every sort of way that somehow the whole ecosystem and humanity exists by the fittest and the most able, but actually that those people who did manage to survive as people and as communities in very early days did so very much by being collaborative, by relying on each other, by reaching out to each other, and also being in touch with nature and with the ecology in those ways. So because we call this the faculty, and we want to sort of, create ideas of thinking between people, so people are also going to be reading and thinking and looking at other practices, as well as thinking about our own and sharing it. We usually ask people, anything about anyone that you've read, or anyone that's become a point of reference for you, and especially in terms of ethics, ethos, ethical practice and politics, who have you gone to? Who's informed the way you're thinking, whether actually speaking to them, knowing them, or reading a book, or listening to a podcast, or something that you recommend to the cohort. So Foxy, if I could start with you this time.
Okay, so for this question, I went to my bookshelf today, which I got very excited about. So a lot of my work my ethics is about kind of say no to no pay. The more I got interested about the kind of experience of lower class artists in the arts, was they couldn't get ahead because a lot of opportunities were unpaid. So my main ethics is that whatever work I do, I must pay the group, even though at the time I had 3 failed Arts Council applications about the project. I was so adamant, even though LADA was giving me free space to do the groups, I had women that wanted to have these conversations. I was quite adamant that I would stick to my guns with that. And sometimes it's a hard one to struggle with, because we need to have these conversations. But so far, I've now had 4 successful Arts Council applications, so I'm able to stick with my ethics. And also, a lot of work with my class is about rising with my class and not out of my class. So a pivotal book for me was Tell Them I Said No by Martin Herbert. It's a collection of essays of artists that have withdrawn from the art world, basically. And I found this book around the time I kind of woke up in my artist state, that I was dragging up to be an artist. I was, the asymmetrical haircut, the talking differently, and I realized I was dragging up. So I basically at that point wanted to, I won't swear, but wanted to basically withdraw from the art world and what it was. So that was a key book for me. I think we've mentioned Paulo Freire, this Pedagogy of the Oppressed, key text for me, because part of my practice is understanding why we're kept in our places, basically what systems are keeping us in our place. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not meant to be having these conversations, and there's like this invisible capitalism that's keeping me here, and they are blocked like a paywall in academic text that we're working class or lower classes are not meant to know the codes, very much like art is. So this book was pivotal in about me wanting to break down those walls and making things more accessible and understanding the systems that keep us in our place. And when I think about class, there's an article I read in The Guardian by Lisa McKenzie called Estate, Class and Culture in Austerity Britain. Really key text for me because a lot of Lisa McKenzie's work is going around having conversations with people and documenting about class and having their voices heard. So yeah, those have been quite pivotal texts for me, along with Grant Kester's conversational pieces and obviously Artificial Hells by Claire Bishop. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a really great text and one or two new ones as well. So thanks so much for that. Kerry?
That's great. Thanks, Fox. No, I haven't got any. It's nuts because I kind of put, well, we've worked on the questions together, but no. And when I was, I think I actually read a lot of stuff, but across quite a broad spectrum. So I couldn't actually pinpoint a pivotal text. And ethics, when I started to get really involved in ethics, I got kind of concerned about ethics within our profession a few years ago, and realizing that as socially engaged practitioners, there is no code of ethics and we can do what the hell we want because we're artists. And to me, that grates. I think that it's quite shocking. And so I started to do some digging around into what ethics is, what is an ethical practice, and so put together, along with the rest of the team, that sort of like the code of ethics for in situ. But that came out of looking at many different documents. So I went to different university websites to see how their sort of code of ethics or ethical conduct is sort of put together. And I think it was John Moore's university had a very good one that I found very inspiring. There was also an environmental organisation that put their code of ethics on their website. And for me, it was kind of like, if we're saying we have an ethical practice, that means nothing. Those are empty words, because what does that mean? We can all say, oh yes, we're ethical. So for me, it was really important that within In Situ, we had a code of ethics that was on our website so that anyone visiting could see that and could see what our code of ethics was. And I should point out that ethics and morals and ethos are all slightly different. So my moral views might not be the same as my ethical views, although they might mirror, but I might have other kind of morals that won't come into the ethics. And the ethics is when you kind of have something that you're sort of pinning up there that people can see and read and understand. And often that is something that you negotiate together. So everybody will have their own moral views. And ethics is something we work on together and negotiate to get a code of ethics or ethical kind of principles or conduct. So yeah, so I kind of brought for my ethics, it's come from lots of different reading within different fields. So looking at, philosophy and sort of the philosophical understanding of ethics, and also, environmental ethics and what that is, and human ethics and how that works in social work and in youth work. So really sort of digging around a bit. And also I remember giving a talk once to a room filled with mainly artists. And one of the questions I asked people to put their hand up if they, if they'd gone to art school, and only everyone bar one put their hand up. And the next question I asked is how many people had actually studied ethics at college. And one person put their hand up, and it was the person who hadn't been to art school. And to me, again, that was kind of like quite, it was quite one of those moments where you think, okay, so why isn't ethics taught at art school? Why isn't it easy to find text or literature on ethics? So yeah, so going back to what we've got on the In Situ website, I would suggest maybe people have a look at that and the ethics that are up on the In Situ's website. That's also something that I sometimes put as a tag. So, you know, if I'm applying for something, I'll use that. And I know other artists who do as well, who say, you know, I'm buying into and I abide by the code of ethics as written out by In Situ. So it's something that you can also use if you want to sort of, you know, let people know what your ethical stance is. Yeah, I've kind of lost the drift a bit there.
Oh, thanks, Kerry. That was great. And I think, you know, the important thing you said was that, you know, ethics is something that's contingent, that you have to agree together. It's not something that you can sort of say, these are the rules and I'm imposing them. But how do you know, agree with them with people? And even when you have your code of ethics, you know, when you're working with a new group, as you say, you need to have that conversation. You need to say, these are the things we put together, you know, can we talk about this? I think that's really important to think about it in that sort of sense. As you say, there's so many people who say, oh, these are our ethics, it's on their website, and then nothing moves in that way. And when I was teaching at Goldsmiths for a while, it was really interesting that it was the art therapist who had an ethical code, and none of the art departments, which was, yeah, really interesting at that point, that none of the artists were thinking about their ethics, whereas the art therapists obviously felt that they had to really, you know, write about that and think about that. So Anna-Marie, where have you come to, you know, with your ethics? Who's influenced you? Who's encouraged you? Who's made you think about things?
Permaculture. That's pretty easy to find. There's a lot of, if you look up permaculture online, there's a very flexible and useful for me ethical underpinning to permaculture, which is the art of designing systems based on natural systems. So it's just the ethics are just basically earth care, fair share, people care, and it's pretty much what it says on the tin, but just a really interesting way to play with like how that might work for you, or how you might explore that in your own practice, is literally to do a Venn diagram overlocking circles. And I've done this with loads of people in different situations, where you just put those three ethics together as like, how much is the earth being cared for and flourishing through what you're doing? How fair is the work you're doing in terms of distribution of resources, inclusion, and thinking of inclusion as beyond the human? And then people care, how well is people's like living, as well as their sort of spiritual and emotional well-being taken care of within the project that you're doing, or within the organization that you're part of. And if you see those as three interlocking circles, then you can just have a really, everyone will put themselves somewhere different basically, and what they, I think, in their ethics and what they would prioritize. And that's brilliant, because then you get a very rich spectrum of people who have got really different drivers and interests, and it's just a really interesting way to start to think about ethics. So I found that really useful. And then something that I sent through this morning, which is some questions that by Brett Bloom, who's from a group called Temporary Services in the States, and he put together this fantastic list of questions which you can use to interrogate your practice. And when I start a project, I go through all these questions and ask them of the design, and think about what's actually happening in the project in relation to these questions. Things like, does the work empower more people than just the authors of the work? Does the work foster egalitarian relationships, access to resources, shifts in thinking, or surpluses for larger groups of people? Does the work abate competitive, abusive power and class structures or other barriers typically found in gallery and museum settings? So they're just very, very useful questions. And then quite often I'll write the answers to them in terms of where I think the project might be, and then it'll be a case of going, actually, no, we're not quite covering that, and that needs more thought. So it's just a really interesting process to go through when you're in the thinking part. And then also the Quakers. So I did a project with Ruth Levine, who's here, and quite a long project called A Field of Wheat, and we had elders in the Quakers guiding us with thinking about how we might create safe and open contemplative spaces for people to speak into. And Quakers have many hundreds of years of learning how to create spaces for reflecting and listening. So there tends to be quite a lot of wisdom to be shared from there. And then finally, Joanna Macy, who's an eco-philosopher and Buddhist, who is just very coherent and clear in speaking about how we might create practices to reconnect our lives and our world. So I'd recommend her book, Coming Back to Life.
Thank you so much. And I know Anne-Marie has made those questions available for us later, so they'll all be, the document will all be shared with you, so you can take advantage of looking at those questions. And yeah, last week the Quakers were mentioned and the influence that the Quakers have had on this way of opening spaces for people, giving space to listen as well as to speak. And yeah, and as you say, hundreds and hundreds of years of experience of doing this. So Stella.
So ethics, I started thinking about ethics about 20 years ago, and I started talking about it, and not very many people were where I were talking about ethics in arts practice at the time. And I kind of I started to articulate my work in terms of values and what those values meant to me, and then to work with others around values that we shared, a little bit like what Kerry was describing. So what values do we share and what do they mean in practice and in action? And then I got really curious about how come when I talked to people, they could articulate their values and their ethical values, and that's what they wanted to work around. And yet there are a whole load of other people that we weren't working with whose values were really different. And I just kind of wanted to understand that. And so a lot of my reading has been around trying to understand why there are people with values that kind of promote inequality, and kind of understanding that inequality isn't an accident, it's a design, and injustice isn't an accident, it's a design, and trying to understand that a bit more. I've read quite widely. I mean, I read everything, and it all influences me. I read poetry a lot. I read around social justice and social from social geographers. So there's an academic called Danny Dorling who's written a lot about injustice. So he's written a really interesting book called Why Social Inequality Persists, where he explains that there's a whole lot of values that are very, very dominant that are not ethical values, and they're values around blaming the poor, labeling the poor as criminal and degenerate, and that is just a fact. So that and those values are really the dominant values in our society. They're promoted by our government, they're promoted by the press, and they're promoted by people. And so the ethical values are this kind of little tiny thing on the edge of these really dominant values that come from a kind of history that's steeped in class and colonialism and racism and gender inequality and so on. And those values are really persisted. So lots of my reading has been around trying to really understand that history and how it continues and how it continues to be promoted. So I read quite a lot around racial justice. So things like British by Afua Hirsch. That was a brilliant book to read. Recently, I've just read Afropean by Johnny Pitts, which is really interesting perspective on sort of the history of Black communities across Europe, and that Black European identity. So that's really brilliant in terms of this practice, in terms of arts practice. I really enjoyed Chrissie's piece, Power Up. One of the best bits of writing around participatory arts and social justice. I'm embarrassing her, but it really is, and I wish I'd written it myself. So if you haven't read Power Up, please do dip into it. So yeah, gosh, I think I'm rambling, but I suppose I kind of read a bit of everything, just to try and understand those kind of power systems.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm blushing, but I'll ignore that bit. I was also thinking, listening to you, about how recently, and I don't know how many of you have been reading Beverly Skeggs, but she is absolutely perfect about, you know, the way that the working class is described, and working class women in particular, and how working class women want to write and talk about themselves. And in the context of my PhD, I found her really, really, really useful to look at that and thinking, yeah, that's how we were on the council estate. That's not how, you know, we're described, though, as you say, in the dominant way of being and way of writing about ethics and values that the dominant society seem to have. So thank you all so much. And there's just one last question before I open it to the floor and ask people from the cohort if there are questions they want to ask, which is just quickly, you know, is there anything you've learned from these recent difficult times that you feel might be important and people might be prepared to take on board moving forward? And I think this time I'm starting with you, Kerry.
Yeah, interestingly, I was asked to write something for co-creating change about ethics, some kind of code of ethics for participatory practice. And I've done a load of kind of forums with different people to get people's views and was pulling it together. Then we went into lockdown last March. And because of the impact of lockdown and because of seeing, I mean, it's almost like somebody was like putting a magnifying glass on the inequalities, and it became, suddenly it was like I was seeing so many more inequalities that I couldn't really sit and write about ethics. And also, you know, the anxiety that I was going through because of the pandemic and not knowing and blah, blah, blah. So I couldn't write about it. And then, of course, we had the murder of George Floyd, and that also made me think about, well, if I'm going to write about this ethic, you know, this thing called ethics, then where do I go with that? So what's happened in the last 12 months, I think, has actually, I think we've probably all been experienced a lot more in a way than we would have before, because life hasn't been normal. So maybe, you know, we're experiencing things slightly differently. And I'm kind of not sure how now I would actually go about writing about ethics or describing it or anything like that. And I felt that that almost like a need to sort of step back a little bit and ground myself a little bit in my locale. Yeah, so the last 12 months has been weird. And the other thing about the last 12 months is, and it sort of goes back to something Anne-Marie was saying, where I live in Scotland, which is in the southwest of Scotland, so it's literally just over the border. The southwest of Scotland has been earmarked for massive afforestation, which is called woodland creation. So there's huge grants available for this woodland creation scheme in the southwest of Scotland, the majority of which is Sitka plantations for production, timber production, which are basically monocultures. And it's basically being kind of branded as this is what we need for climate crisis, you know, to sequestrate the carbon, this is what we need for our economy, but at the same time, it's devastating local ecologies and wildlife. And it's also, you know, changing the landscape dramatically. It's almost like an industrial revolution, but a rural industrial revolution. And people are not being consulted. So in the last 12 months where I've not been making art, I've been getting very much involved in these, you know, sort of woodland creation, afforestation, plantation sort of schemes, and trying to sort of stop them, change thinking, look at new science around that. So almost kind of lockdown has given me, you know, what's happened over the last 12 months has kind of given me a space to go into an area that I probably wouldn't have gone into before, because I would have had work commitments. And also the other interesting thing, I mean, this is like, there's so much, it feels like there's so much stuff going on at the moment. I'm a member of the Scottish Artists Union. Before I moved here, I was a member of the English Artists Union, because I think it's important that artists have some kind of union representation. And in England, it's a new thing. So it's only been going for a few years. I can't remember how many now, maybe 10 years. And, you know, it's something that I would encourage people to join, because they kind of could do with the support anyway, but also you might need them one day. And I was just sent recently a questionnaire by the Scottish Artists Union, and a lot of it was to do with COP26, which is the upcoming kind of climate crisis gathering in Glasgow. And one of the questions on that was for artists to explain, through the questionnaire, was to explain why you're concerned about climate crisis. And also that kind of made me think that is kind of completely back to front question, because shouldn't we all be concerned about climate crisis? And wouldn't the more sort of poignant question be for people to explain why they are not concerned about climate crisis? So I sometimes think the way kind of questions are framed can be back to front, because it accepts that, the norm is that we're not bothered. And what is unusual is to be bothered, and therefore we want people to tell us why they might be bothered about something, rather than kind of flipping it on its head. So yeah, it's a strange time. I feel like this is a strange time we're living in. Obviously, it's impacted on the faculty as well, because we are here on a Zoom format rather than in person. So I've not actually met hardly any of you, and I would love to be in the room, and I would love to have conversations continue after 12 o'clock, but they won't. I'd love to go for coffees with people. So it's been a strange year where I've gone through a lot of rethinking, relearning, adapting, probably sort of trying to get a bit more up to date with my technologies, which is also always difficult for me. But yeah.
Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, so just following on from what Kerry said about the online having to shift. So we had a decision to make around whether to shift, just to forget the year, or to shift onto online, and then we explored that with various levels of success and not success, and eventually created an event that felt like it kind of worked. But then in that kind of excitement of going, God, you can do some quite interesting stuff online, I just think I forget that there's a whole load of people that don't have access to online, and it really doesn't work for them at all. So there's like a whole new set of possibilities in terms of who might come and be part of things, but then you're still excluding tons of people. So it's like it's not a viable alternative to live events, even though live events can also exclude lots of people. And so it's just trying to stay aware that both of maybe some kind of way of balancing or working with the two together is quite an interesting possibility, because they have really different sets of people that engage with them, and what happens in those spaces is really, really different. So I'm still kind of working all that through. So for example, we live in a little town in Devon, and then we did an event online which had a global reach, and we were having participants from all around the world being part of that, which we would never ever have done before, and connecting from their position as coastal communities in vulnerable spaces in terms of climate change and sea level rise. So that's great. But then there's loads of other things that aren't great, and loads of people that wouldn't have gone to that event. And so I guess I'm just still sort of, all of that's so new. It's still playing in my mind, like, how are we going to work with that going forward? And then also this idea of wanting to, well, I think Chrissie, you were kind of mentioning earlier, like people maybe thinking about, hey, where am I local? Like, where are my roots? This sort of sense of actually maybe we need to start hunkering down a bit more in the places that we love, and working perhaps more in the places, I don't know, shrinking our lives a little bit. And so that's sort of still really, again, something that I'm noticing in other people and in myself is, okay, where am I going to work? How are we going to work? Where am I going to work? How do we stay connected if we do want to be hyperlocal? Because those connections feel really important still. And then also, I guess in me, there's a real nervousness and fear around the fact that the climate and ecological emergency is not going away, and we've kind of lost 18 months at least in terms of developing the debate and trying to move that debate forward. And also there's other things happening in Parliament and government now, like the policing bill, which are starting to clamp down on activism and public expression. So how on earth are we going to keep, and yet there's a real acknowledgement across the board that like the activism of the last few years has been quite successful in moving the debate and action forward, and yet that action is being potentially halted by things that are happening in Parliament. We've kind of taken our focus off mainstream politics for a year and a half and off the climate and ecological emergency, and that causes me quite a lot of anxiety. So yeah, there's a rich stew of confusing stew of thoughts about what's happened in the last year.
Thank you. Stella?
I guess I've been kind of exercised recently around this sort of steady shift to the right in European politics and actually across the world, and the kind of increase in populism, and how we as people who involved in creativity, how we respond to that, and what our role is in that. And I'm also quite interested in how a lot has been revealed, particularly in the last year, about the way that arts organisations are structured, and particularly around structural racism within organisations, and how arts organisations are kind of a mirror to the classist system, to the colonial system, and the immigration system. They kind of replicate those systems and those hierarchies. And it makes me wonder whether it's possible for arts organisations to really, truly be activists when the highest paid person in an arts organisation maybe earns 10 or 20 times more than the lowest paid person in an arts organisation. And this is my learning for the time, is around if we really want to be activists in the arts, we can't work in those settings. We can't replicate or work in an organisation that replicates colonial and class structures and immigration systems, like, you know, where an artist can't get through a barrier because it only lets some people, it's sort of semi-permeable, it lets some people through the door and not others, and it defines quality in a sort of in a very hierarchical way, like, you know, what is quality, what is art, who makes art is already defined. And it kind of, it's made me want to change the way I work completely, but I'm a bit impatient and it takes time to really shift those things. So those lots of things. And also really, I just read a report by Selena Nwulu called "It's More Than Black People on a Stage." And one of the things, I mean, there's lots of really interesting things in that report, but one of the things that I really liked in the report is what artists said, that they want to have a voice. Artists, freelance artists, want to have a voice about how things develop and about the strategy. And I think freelance artists have often been kind of sidelined and not given a voice about how organizations are run, how organizations make decisions. They're never given any voice in leadership. And I think that's something that we need to radically rethink.
Yeah, thank you. Changing systems and changing the way that we mirror society. Fox.
So going back to what happened over the last year, what we all know, because for me it was, I was working with a group just before the pandemic, and I had to kind of close the group. And as you know, I work with working class, benefit class, underclass communities, and basically we had to shift to online. But I was working with communities hit by the hardest by the pandemic. A lot of the women I work with were on benefits, were carers, were in precarious jobs, and so I had to shift the way we worked. And I had in mind for the project when I started, there would be an end product. I got rid of that idea quite quickly, and I moved the narrative for the group was how could we use the kind of resources that we've used as within the arts as working class to navigate, to kind of adapt them and to kind of navigate the arts. So there's a shift to that, and a shift to more radical care and thinking, and I think that's what needs to happen next. This pandemic has hit the arts one of the hardest. It shows that it's not a viable living for artists. Many of us freelancers are working or, you know, trying to do ad hoc jobs. And I've been quite lucky because I use live art as a strategy to move in with that in and out the jobs that I do. But I hope to think that this is kind of leveled off some and will cause some kind of radical rethinking about how the arts are organized and become a viable living. And it's so funny because Kerry said before, one of the group said to me, I think I'm going to become a post person, you know, rather than me an artist. Younger artists, especially, you know, all artists don't see it as a viable living. So I hope something with the pandemic has causes us to really radically think about of being an artist as a living. And also for me, with I do a lot of work about class, but working class is often prefixed by the word white. And I think Stella's, you know, put this a lot more articulate that I'm going to say. But for me, moving forward is how we can share that narrative of the whole working class identity and how organizations can reach out better. For me, I've moved from being an independent artist to now an artist that can commission artists. And what I've realized quite fast and quite suddenly is it's not just good enough to say we are particularly wanting to hear from people of color or this. It's where you reach out. And I've still got that level of push when I work with organizations to push that further because I'm independent. But that is really kind of really important for me. Also, you know, I'll start just one last thing is I'm based in the South. I've done a lot of work in the South. Just simply moving up to the North as well has made me realize that reaching out, putting these open calls out saying, you know, we're going to pay you. I've had artists in the North approach me saying, I can't apply for this because it'll affect my benefits. So to really kind of all these things that I think there needs to be a radical kind of restructure within the arts. And I know this is what this space is for. And how we can just reach out better is really key for me. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all of you so much. And I think everyone's spoken so clearly and with such insight into these issues. I feel really privileged to be chairing this morning.